I'm always lying on my stomach or on my side. I feel totally awake but unable to move, and there's this deep rising panic that happens. I feel like totally conscious and I can rationally like explain what's happening while it's happening, but at the same time there's this kind of like primal fear, I suppose, that something's just wrong, and that tends to just dissipate immediately when I kind of jerk suddenly because movement comes back in an instant, and then I'm awake completely. Well, when it happens, I'm always in my bed on my own. It tends to happen after I've had very little sleep for a long period of time. When it happens, I am almost always on my stomach, so I don't see much. However, I often get this feeling that there's this presence there, that as if I open my eyes, I'm going to see something watching me. It's quite surreal, but that feeling, like, again, disappears as soon as I can open my eyes, as soon as I can move. Well, it was strange. It was like this kind of cognitive dissonance. At the same time I was feeling this fear, I was also able to be completely rational and know what was happening. I knew what I was experiencing as I was experiencing it, but it was as if my mind and my nerves were just working against each other and weren't working together. You know, so when I get sleep paralysis, I always try to wiggle my fingers to try and like bring movement back. But this time when I did it, I could move my fingers, but it was as if they had no resistance with my bed or my other fingers. And I realised I could lift my hand. When I lifted it up, I realised that my surroundings weren't my bedroom. I was surrounded by what I guess I could only describe as like purple clouds and like lots of like stars in space. You know, like one of them photoshopped screensavers you see. It was a very like surreal experience. It felt extremely real. I have no idea what could have induced it. I've never done drugs or had any kind of psychological problems that have, could have caused that. And it's never happened since. But I had this feeling that I was floating, like whether like in the air or in water, I couldn't really tell. But it felt like weirdly euphoric. I normally panic when I have like regular sleep paralysis, but this time I was just kind of like in amazement because of how real it was and how surreal at the same time, kind of how beautiful it was. But then I looked down and I could see my bed and I could see myself clear as day. And then I like really panicked. I thought I'd like died and I was leaving my body. So I kind of like shifted side to side as if I could like reach down to myself. And I did. I managed to reach my hand down, and as soon as I touched myself, I was like back in my own body, and I woke up like really quickly. Like when I get sleep paralysis, I'm in this weird sort of limbo where I know I'm awake, but at the same time I don't feel completely awake. This time, it was as if I felt really there, but then in an instant my mind and my sight was from one place into another, and I shot out of bed, sat up, and I like gasped loudly, but it wasn't out of like struggling to breathe like I do with sleep paralysis. It was just sheer shock, and like everything just suddenly went back to normal. But I've never experienced it since. It's really stuck with us because it was quite strange. When I had the second experience, it kind of quite affected my worldview. I've always been quite a scientifically minded person, I guess you could say. I've never been one to dismiss things like like the spiritual side of things, but I've always thought that there was a rational explanation, and that spirituality was less of a literal thing, and it was more of a philosophical view of the real world rather than something more. When I had this experience, I did start to question that quite a bit because of how vivid and real it felt. It changed quite a lot how I saw the world, because while it were happening, like normally when I have sleep paralysis, it is scary. This one, I was like kind of blown away. I was like, wow, this is actually like what's there, and it felt euphoric at the time, and even afterwards. I felt very uplifted to think that such a thing could exist, if not in the real world. The fact that my mind could project something so realistic in that was quite interesting. I've always been into my fantasy, and fantasy, like Tolkien himself, because I'm a big fan of Lord of the Rings, Tolkien himself said that fantasy was an exercise in escapism, and I always took that as something you have to strive for. But it was as if for a moment that just kind of happened to me without my consent. But I was okay with it. It was wild. I feel choked quite badly because like most of the time I am on my stomach, so that gets in the way of like my diaphragm when I'm breathing. And also the worst is when I have it and I'm face down on my pillow. So for a full 30 seconds my body's panicking and trying to gasp for air as I'm breathing into a pillow, and then it's only once I'm fully awake I can like pull myself out of it. So I guess if you were to like visualize it, I'd say like it's quite claustrophobic. Imagine being like locked in a coffin or something like that. Pretty much every experience is the same. I'd say like 9 times out of 10 it's just regular sleep paralysis, and I get that regular panic because I can't move and anything like that. It's only like very, very rarely. I can only remember 2 or 3 times where I felt this weird presence there. But besides that, I get it quite rarely. I can get it in long periods depending on how poorly I'm sleeping at the time. I haven't had any recently, but I was having it at its worst probably about a year and a half ago, because then my sleeping pattern was completely nocturnal, and I was trying to force myself into a diurnal sleeping pattern, and it just wasn't having it. So I guess my brain was strained, and that was what caused it. I always sleep on my back. It's almost as if it's caused by me turning in my sleep and then being on my stomach. I'm no idea why that would be, but that tends to be what it is. I sometimes get this like jerky feeling, like I'm falling asleep, and then, like, you know, when you go into like light REM sleep, and you know, you feel like that falling sensation. I think like sleep paralysis is when that happens, but the shock doesn't fully wake you up, I think, or at least it doesn't wake your body up. Obviously it wakes your mind up. I think that might be what causes it, like, primarily. In a weird way, I don't like it at the time, but I do like it because of how interesting it is. I do find all the stuff of how the human like brain works. Like I said, I normally get it when I haven't slept for a long period of time. I think it's probably something to do with that strain on your brain from going from that, you know, straining itself and being awake for so long to then suddenly shutting down and going to sleep. And I think it might struggle to do that, and that's why it happens. But I think the panic, the kind of like instinctual panic that I get when it happens is really offset by how interesting it is, but it doesn't happen enough for it to be a problem in any way.